Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let us continue with our tafsir of Surah Al-Baqarah bihawlillahi wa quwwatih. We are on ayah number 260. قال الله تعالى وإذ قال إبراهيم رب أرني كيف تحيي الموتى قال أولم تؤمن قال بلى ولكن ليطمئن قلبي قال فخذ أربعة من الطير فصرهن إليك ثم اجعل على كل جبل منهن جزءا ثم ادعهن يأتينك سعيا واعلم أن الله عزيز حكيم. So in this ayah, Ibrahim alayhi salam is asking Allah Jalla wa Ala, show me, meaning he wants a visual. Show me how you give life to the dead. Now why did he ask this question? Various reasons are given, and it's not so important to know the background. The point is, Ibrahim alayhi salam is asking this question. So one reason that is suggested is that after his argument with Nimrud about the resurrection, Ibrahim alayhi salam wanted to know how the resurrection happens. Of course he believed in the resurrection, we know that, but he had never seen it manifest in front of his eyes. This is what he wanted to see. And Allah asks him, أَوَلَمْ تُؤْمِنْ? Do you not have Iman? Iman is a key word, we have spoken about this before. Of course, this is not a question of inquiry, that is impossible. This is a question of taqreer, when you ask a question to establish and confirm the truth, so that Allah Jalla wa Ala hears it from the mouth of Ibrahim himself. Then after the belief is established and confirmed, then Allah will show the kayfiyah, the how of it. Ibrahim alayhi salam replies Bala, which means yes. The word Bala means yes to a negative question, as in, do you not believe? Then you reply Bala, meaning yes, I do believe. Technically, if you were to reply Na'am, yes, then that would actually mean you do not believe. Allah Jalla wa Ala tells him, فَخُذْ, from أَخَذَ يَأْخُذُ, meaning to take, and take أَرْبَعَةً, 4, min al-tayr, from the birds, means take 4 birds. فَصُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ. Now he says, فَصُرْهُنَّ إِلَيْكَ, from Sara Yasuru, which means to incline something and bring it closer to you. This is the majority tafsir. There is a minority tafsir which reads it as sirhunna with a kasra, which means to cut it. But even on the majority tafsir for surhunna with a dhamma, they say what is being referred to is not just merely inclining these 4 birds to you, but rather it is to slaughter them. Mufassirun like Ibn Abbas and other than him, they give the account that Ibrahim alayhi salam cut these birds into pieces. As for what these birds were, some suggestions have been made, but it really does not matter. So they say he slaughtered them, removed their feathers, tore the birds into pieces, and he placed parts of these mixed pieces on 4 or 7 hills. He kept the heads of these birds. After that, Allah commanded Ibrahim to call these birds, and the birds came flocking to him. The word used is sa'ya, which means to hurry or to move quickly. This could either be running towards Ibrahim, or it could also be flying towards Ibrahim. The point is, they came hurriedly. Ibrahim alayhi salam, they say, witnessed the feathers and the flesh and the blood of these birds forming and moving over to the correct bird. So that is, the feathers of bird number 1 moved to bird number 1, forming it, and so on. And so every bird came back to life. And each bird at that point was headless. It came hurriedly to Ibrahim to collect its head. And each bird would only take its proper head and refuse the other ones. And he finishes the ayah off by saying that you must know, i'lam. We spoke about what the word ilm means, it's a key word. Know that Allah is Azizun Hakim. These names have preceded, and each of these names has 3 meanings, which we have spoken about before. Okay, let's reflect on this amazing ayah. Firstly, we take from this ayah that Ibrahim alayhi salam is calling out to Allah by saying Rabbi. And this is one of the etiquettes of dua that you call out to Allah by using the word Rabb, because only a true Rabb can actually answer your dua, no one else. We also take that Ibrahim a.s. is not in any doubt about the resurrection. We know that from the debate with Nimrud. But rather, when he says that my heart should yatma'in, which means to find tranquility, it is to increase in his tranquility. Because when you see something, it gives you a different level of certainty than when you believe without seeing. The Prophet himself said that hearing of a news is not quite the same as actually seeing it. We've all heard the news that resurrection is going to happen, but we have not seen it. So we do not have that level of certainty, the certainty from the eyes, which we called Aynul Yaqeen. We have Ilmul Yaqeen, the certainty of knowledge, which comes about through hearing about something or reading about it. So we may take from this that your Iman and your certainty is of levels. People do not have the same level of Iman, and people do not have the same level of certainty either. We also find from this ayah the immense relationship between Allah and Ibrahim a.s. in that Allah acceded to his request to show him how Allah gives life to the dead, because the request from Ibrahim a.s. was an immense one. It's not something you normally expect Allah Jalla wa'ala to accede to just like that. But the relationship between Ibrahim a.s. and Allah was indeed a special one. Ibrahim was the Khalil of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let us take ayah number 261. مثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. In this ayah, Allah Jalla wa Ala is giving us a parable. The parable of the one who ينفقون, they spend, from أنفق ينفق إنفاقا, to spend. Where do they spend their wealth? في سبيل الله, in the way of Allah, meaning in those avenues which will please Allah Jalla wa Ala, seeking the reward of Allah thereby. So their parable is like the parable of a habba, which is a grain. This is sowed into the land, and it gives rise to 7 sanabil, which is the plural of sunbula. Sunbula means an ear, not a human ear, but the ear which has grains in them, which grows from the ground. And he says in each sumbula there are 100 grains. So that makes a total of 700 grains. In other words, you sow 1 grain and it gives rise to 700 grains. This is the parable of the one who spends in the way of Allah. You spend £1 and you are rewarded for 700 pounds. So 1 to 700 is the ratio given in this ayah. He says, and Allah yudha'ifu, from the verb dha'afa, yudha'ifu, meaning to multiply. Allah multiplies to whomsoever He wills. And He says Allah is wasi', expansive, that is to say, He is expansive in all of His attributes. Alim, meaning knowledgeable. You may notice in this ayah that the mumathal, the one being made a parable of, is the one spending in the way of Allah, the one who is working. And the mumathal bihi, the one which is the parable, is the actual grain which is being sown in the land. Now, of course, there is a disparity here. The worker, the one doing the spending, cannot be similar to the grain itself being sown. So the way to understand it would be to say as follows: the parable of the work of those who spend in the way of Allah is like the parable of a grain being sown in the land. So now, if understood this way, we are comparing a work with a work, and that makes sense. Or if you want to compare the worker with a worker, then you could say the parable of the one who spends in the way of Allah is like the parable of the farmer who sows a seed. So then you're comparing a worker with a worker. And both ways of looking at this ayah are appropriate. Let us reflect on this ayah. The obvious lesson that we can take from this ayah is when you explain matters to the people, use parables which they are familiar with. Because in those days, many people were engaged in agriculture. So this is a parable that they are used to. So we learn a great teaching lesson. We take from this ayah also the obvious lesson of the virtue of spending your money in the way of Allah. So in those matters which will please Allah Jalla wa Ala, such as funding the mujahideen who are fighting in the way of Allah, and other than that, and you are doing it out of ikhlas as well, not out of showing off. We take from this ayah how expansive Allah Jalla wa Ala is in rewarding you. In Sahih Muslim, for example, we find that a man brought a camel with its bridle and he said, "O Messenger of Allah, I'm giving this camel away in charity for the sake of Allah." And the Prophet replied, "Laka biha yawm al-qiyamati sab'umi'ati naqa." You will have 700 camels on Yawm al-Qiyamah. So the point is that Allah rewards you liberally. So He does not give you justice. Justice would be you give one camel and you are rewarded for one camel. That is justice. Rather, Allah Jalla wa Ala gives you grace, which is more than what you deserve. We learn from this ayah as well that Allah Jalla wa Ala is expansive in all of His attributes. He is knowledgeable over everything. And we also learn that He has a will, because He says, لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ. Ayah 262. الَّذِينَ يُنْفِقُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ ثُمَّ لَا يُتْبِعُونَ مَا أَنْفَقُوا مَنًّا وَلَا أَذًى لَهُمْ أَجْرُهُمْ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ وَلَا خَوْفٌ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. So carrying on the theme of spending in the way of Allah Jalla wa Ala, in the last ayah, He was encouraging us. But in this ayah, He informs us of a particular pitfall when you spend in the way of Allah Jalla wa Ala. And this is to say, when you spend in the way of Allah, you need to be sure to avoid two things. He uses the word yutbi'una, which means to make something follow something. So after they spend, which is a good thing, they follow up on this spending with man. Now what does this mean? It means here in this context, reminding somebody of what you gave them or spent on them. A typical example of this would be that you give charity to somebody. Now charity is that you give away something and you do not demand anything back. Because if you do demand something back, that is a trade. But a charity is not a trade. You give it and you forget about it. That's the whole point of charity. However, what if you give somebody in charity and maybe, say the next month, he says or does something to you which annoys you or angers you, and you respond by saying, "Oh look how you're treating me, and just 1 month ago I gave you such and such a charity. Is this how you repay me?" So do you see what you've done there? You've turned your charity into a secret trade. Because now, after 1 month, you're demanding from him that he should repay you for the charity. So this is to say, repay you by treating you nicely. But that is a trade. You've turned your charity into a trade 1 month later. And you have thereby spoilt your charity and nullified your reward. Because this is no longer a charity. So there's your first pitfall. The second one is adha, which means harm or injury or annoyance. So the one you gave charity to, if you were to annoy them or harm them or injure them in some way, this would nullify your charity. And some people may be brave and bold and think that just because they have given charity to that person, they can do with them as they wish. And it's not like the one who received their charity has a right to complain, because after all, they are benefiting from the charity that was given to them. So they may feel emboldened to harm or abuse the one they've given charity to. In any case, following up your charity with any type of harm, be it verbal or physical, will annul your charity. So beware. So he says, those people who do not follow up their charity with these two pitfalls, they will have their ajr, their reward, and there will be no khawf, fear on them. This means to say no fear on Yawm al-Qiyamah. وَلَا هُمْ يَحْزَنُونَ. They will not grieve, meaning they will not grieve over all the good stuff and the pleasures that pass them by in this world. Let's see what benefits we may take from this ayah. The main lesson to learn here is, by all means, spend in the way of Allah, but do not ruin your charity by falling into these two pitfalls. So the idea is to give your charity and forget about it, as if you did not ever give in charity. Do not remind your beneficiary that you gave him charity, and indeed do not mention it to other people that you gave fulan charity, because then this is you trying to gain some recognition from your charity, and again, this is a type of trade, because you give charity and you want something back. Recognition in this case. Okay, what if you inform someone that you gave somebody charity, but you do not make mention of who that somebody is? We say in a case like this, you should avoid it, because it is feared that you might feel pleased about yourself, or indeed showing off may creep into your heart, so avoid any mention of you giving charity. It is possible to make an exception to this rule and say that if you make mention of your charity in order that other people may follow your example, because maybe you see apathy amongst people in giving charity, so you're trying to give them a little boost, and you do that by making mention that you're giving charity so that others can follow along. Because sometimes all it needs is for other people to see somebody practicing a righteous deed, and that spurs them on to following in this righteous path. If that's the case, and that is the scenario, then there should not be anything wrong with this type of statement. It would be similar to giving charity in open so that everyone can see you in order for them to follow your footsteps. So this is not showing off. Rather, this is for a greater benefit. We notice in this ayah that he says that their reward is with Allah, عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ. What does that imply? It implies that the reward is indeed great because it's coming from the greatest possible being. And the greatness of the reward depends on the greatness of the one giving it. And we also pick up that such people who spend in the way of Allah and do not spoil their charity, they will have no khawf nor any huzn, and we explained what that means. And enough is that as a virtue. Wallahu a'lam.